Eva. I'm going to challenge Eva because she kind of suggests that I'm an expert in tuberous sclerosis. I always say it when I'm at family meetings. I'm not the expert in tuberous sclerosis. You are the experts in tuberous sclerosis. I acknowledge that I might have some technical expertise in TSC and in mental health and neurodevelopment, but you are the people who live with TSC. And we talked about it yesterday. My first rule when I meet any family, any mum or dad, is the parents are always right. You live with it, you are always right, and never forget that. So I was asked by Eva to talk about TAND, setting the scene, why and what. Now, in a way, and I'm conscious that we're already late with time, the why we've kind of done. Because Annemie, thank you for your beautiful presentation. Anne and Eva, I've already said to you why TAND is such an important thing. So we can skip that bit. The what, you've already heard all the examples, so we can skip that too. So I can stop now. Shall I stop, Geert? Or we can go on in just a little bit more detail. Shall we go on in a little bit more detail, maybe? So in that case, firstly, greetings from beautiful Cape Town to all of you. Here you can see the University of Cape Town. And right in the foreground, you can actually see, this is where I work. This is the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, where I've been for the last 7 years. And before I went back to Cape Town, even though I was born in Cape Town, I actually spent 20 years in Cambridge, which is where I did a PhD on tuberous sclerosis and started doing clinical work and research in TSC, and have been doing it for the last 21 years. And so this is my 21st anniversary in the TSC family. I'm going to talk mainly about TAND, and that's the job that I was given by Anne and Eva. But you will also see in your programs that there's a special dedication of the whole meeting, and we talked about it yesterday, and I thought I should just mention it today. So we're dedicating the whole meeting yesterday and today to this person called Lauren Leclésio. So Lauren, that's quite a French name. Her husband is Mauritian, so they're French Mauritian, hence the Leclésio surname. Lauren was a developmental neuropsychologist who worked with me. She did her master's degree with me and a PhD with me. And a lot of the things I'm going to talk about was work that she did while she was working with me in the team. And Lauren very sadly died early this year, very young, at the age of 36. And so in the TSC community, we therefore wanted to find an appropriate way just to make sure that we remember the work that she's done and celebrate the work that she has done. I was conscious when I was listening to Annemie's examples and Anna and Eva, the risk is that the meeting might become a little bit gloomy, because so far we've only talked about kind of difficult things, right, and sad things. And that's true. We live with sadness and we live with difficulties, but it's also important at a family meeting that we don't just talk about difficulties and challenges, right? Do you agree? I get a few thumbs up here. Here you can see Lauren in the TSCI community. There she is next to me. You might see some other familiar faces here today. Some others there in the audience. Where are they? Mika, Carla. There's Guillaume that Eva has just presented the French findings from. But I want to introduce you. I suddenly changed my slides just while they were talking, and I want to introduce you to somebody else as well. So here you can see me, and next to me is my brother. And his name is Friedel. He's now 38. As you can tell, he has Down syndrome. He also has autism. He also has intellectual disability. And here we are, flying business class on British Airways. He has in his hand his iPad, and he has his headphones on. He looks, as you can tell, extremely happy. And I suddenly decided to put up the picture because, yes, living with disability brings challenges and hardship. But when we actually ask families and people who live with disability about the good and the bad of the disability, we typically list more positive things than we list negative things. Because living with disability changes our lives in profound ways, and many of those are actually really positive ways in which our lives are changed. And so I suddenly decided, let's just remind ourselves not just of the challenges of living with disabilities, but also about the amazing things that come with it. He has two particular interests. One is rugby. He knows much more about rugby than I certainly know. And his other interest is opera. And he certainly knows more about opera than I do. You can ask him to name Mozart operas and he will, or Wagner operas, or composers. So he has so many strengths and skills, not just deficits and disabilities. And I wanted just really to bring that theme back. And I'll just say, thank you. And I'll just come back to that right at the end when we finish as well. So why did we create this term TAND? And then I'll come on to what we mean by it and how we divide it up into different ways. Well, this is the bit that you've heard. Most people with tuberous sclerosis will have some neuropsychiatric manifestations at some point in their lives. Most. And the studies we've done, 90%, pretty much everybody with TSC has some of these challenges at some point in their life. And yet, when we, some years ago in Britain, did a survey and asked families like you, how many of them and how many of their children ever had any assessments or any treatments, it was 18%. So most people had some of these challenges and almost nobody had any assessment or any treatment. Message number one was remember the positives of living with disability. Message number two to you all is all the things that I'm going to talk about, we can do something to make it better. Remember that, all of them, we can improve. So I'm not going to talk about anything that we can't do something about. Often people think we can't, but everything we can improve and do something about. So it was striking to us that people weren't looking and doing anything to improve lives of people with TSC. And the third reason was there were lots of confusion about the language and terms that people were using in the TSC community. And let me show you some of them. This might be hard for the translators into English or Dutch or French, but up there on the board you can see lots of different words that you will use and that your specialists will use and that colleagues will use. They all mean particular things, but they mean different things to different people. And so if I talk to somebody in education, they might use different language. Or if I talk to a pediatric neurologist, they might use different language. And that's led to lots of confusion. And so we wanted to find a way to make it easier for people to have a shared language about all these neuropsychiatric challenges. And that was the reason. Those were the three reasons why we made up this term TAND. And no, yes, it does mean tooth as well. That's true, Annemie. It means, it's the same word in my language, Afrikaans. And I'm told that are there any Austrian people here? Anyone from Austria? Apparently Tand in Austrian means beautiful but useless. So what we're hoping is that it will not be beautiful but useless to us in the TSC community. And so what we said is TAND is an umbrella term that captures all the range and different levels of manifestations and challenges that people might have. And you're welcome to take a picture of this one if you like. That's my favorite picture of the day. Well, apart from the one of my brother. And what I'm going to do now is just to show you and give you examples of each of the different levels and tell you what the most common things are that we see in people who have TSC. Okay? So let's start with the first level. The first level is what we call the behavior level. This is simply the kind of worries and concerns that you as mum or dad or people who live with TSC might have. And these are the things that might make you go to the doctors. And in tuberous sclerosis, so they're just observations. That's, in TSC, we see lots of almost anything. Aggression, temper tantrums, anxiety, difficulties with language, sleep problems, eating problems, attention difficulties, restlessness, name it. Almost any of these challenges we can see in people with TSC. Some of those difficulties we see more in people with intellectual disability, but some of them we see in everybody. So it's not just in those with intellectual disability. Some of them correlate, we see more in people with epilepsy, but many of them we also see in people who've never had epilepsy. So it makes it an important thing to remember for people with TSC. So those are the behaviors. Those aren't diagnoses. They are the reasons we're going to go to the next step. And here's the next step. The next step is the psychiatric level. This is when you are now going to come to the doctor and say, I'm worried about my child because he looks a bit sad and he's not eating so well and he's not sleeping so well. And then the doctor will say, oh, I wonder if he might have depression. And they will do that. We have standard approaches to evaluate people for all the psychiatric conditions that there may be. We will say, are there enough things? Are they there for long enough? Do we exclude other things that it might be instead? And then we will give a diagnosis. And the most common diagnosis, the most common psychiatric disorders that we see in tuberous sclerosis are autism spectrum disorders. Almost half of people have an autism spectrum disorder. And many people with TSC, even if they don't have an autism spectrum disorder, have difficulties with social interactions. Many people have lots of shyness, feel awkward in social settings. It's a very common thing in TSC. The second common diagnosis is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Again, about half of people with TSC might meet criteria. If I assess them as a psychiatrist, I would say, yes, you meet criteria for ADHD. But one of the striking things is a study that we did in the UK. I diagnosed a large group of kids, assessed them, diagnosed more than half of them with ADHD, and only one of them had ever been treated for ADHD. So it's just another example that people don't think about these conditions in TSC, and so they don't assess and diagnose and treat appropriately. Mood and anxiety disorders are the second main group of problems that we see in people with tuberous sclerosis, particularly from teenage years and into adulthood. Colleagues in Cardiff did a study, and they took people with completely normal intellectual abilities with TSC, assessed them for anxiety disorders, and found that 60%, 60, that's the majority of people with TSC, had an anxiety disorder. And none of them were diagnosed by their doctors, and none of them had been treated by their doctors for their anxiety disorder. So you can see these are the reasons why we get worried, because we can treat these things if we pick them up appropriately. Just a little practical detail, psychotic disorders, when people hear voices or see things and have disturbed thinking, that's actually not unusual. That's no more common in TSC than it is outside TSC. So the practical lesson, if your family member develops some of these things, we should always think, is there something about epilepsy? Because seizure disorders can lead to many of these psychotic phenomena rather than schizophrenia or those sorts of disorders. The next level, we've talked behavioral level, psychiatric level, now the intellectual level. This is when we're going to do IQ type tests on people. How many people here have had, or have family members have had IQ tests? Good. Annemie, did you pass your IQ test?
My son.
Oh, good. Oh, your son. Okay, all right. So when we do IQ tests, all of us fall on a kind of a normal curve. So it's like when we see how tall we are. Most of us are average tall, some people are very tall, and some people are very short. And so we have a standard way of saying, if you fall in the bottom group, then we say you have intellectual disability if we also have evidence that your functioning in daily life is impaired in significant ways. So that's how we define intellectual disability. And as you know, in TSC, about half of people have completely normal intellectual ability, and the other half have some degree of intellectual disability. So those are the kind of main boxes. But the more important thing, I think, is people have very unusual profiles. If I did an assessment on anybody with TSC, they're likely to have some things that they do really well as part of their IQ test, some things that they really struggle with, some things that are a little bit better. And so there's a very uneven profile of IQ performance. And so the risk is, if we just give an average score, if we say your total number is 100, it doesn't tell us very much about your strengths and your weaknesses and your ability to function in daily life. So just bear that in mind whenever people do an IQ type test. Just a word on IQ, given that this is a family meeting. Let me go back to my brother. He would certainly, if he has an IQ test, he would certainly fall in the bottom 2%, without a doubt. And people would say he has moderate intellectual disability, mean IQ, he probably has an IQ of about 45 or maybe 50 if he's lucky on a good day. It looks terrible, it sounds terrible, right? Intellectual disability sounds awful. It doesn't tell us anything about the person. It doesn't tell us anything about the good things and the positive things about the person. So just remember that. IQ is one thing that tells us some information, but it doesn't tell us all the information. The next level is what we call the academic level or the scholastic level. This is when we're going to look at how kids do in school, reading, writing, spelling, mathematics, those sorts of things. Why this is a separate level is many people with TSC, even if they have completely normal intellectual abilities, struggle in school. And so often, kids have an assessment and people would say, oh, your IQ is 100, you shouldn't have to struggle with all these things in school, you should try harder, right? And the problem is, you can have specific difficulties, specific disorders in those skills, even if your IQ is very high. So it's a separate level. When we, in the Tosca study, looked for scholastic difficulties, we found that almost 60% of people in the study had some academic difficulties. And they continue into adult life, so that many people with TSC also still have some difficulty. Often it's with spelling, and the most common thing is with mathematics, numbers, doing sums, those sorts of things. The next level, number 5, we're almost at the end, is what we call the neuropsychological level. This is different from IQ. IQ is kind of a sum of top-line skills. This is about specific brain skills that happens in specific parts of our brain. And we can do all sorts of assessments to see what people's strengths and weaknesses are. And here are some of the common ones that we see as difficult in TSC. Many people have memory difficulties. That's about recalling information. You know that it's somewhere in your head, but you can't quite get it out. Many people have difficulties with what we call executive skills, things like planning, organizing themselves, being able to be flexible. Many people with TSC get stuck a little bit when they try one thing and it doesn't work. It's hard to shift to something else. Many people struggle with attention. And the most common bit of that is doing two things at the same time. Many people with TSC get overwhelmed when they have to do two things at the same time. And they feel overwhelmed and anxious, and sometimes it even makes them aggressive when they get overwhelmed by doing all these things at the same time. So the message I gave yesterday as well, about dual tasking, all men and most people with TSC struggle with dual tasking, right? Remember that. So I thought, at this point, let's just go. I'm going to steal a minute to do a little game with you. I'm going to make you test some of your own neuropsychological skills, okay? You have to do this in English. I think it's easier if everybody does it in English. So on the board, I'm going to show you a long list of numbers like this, okay? And what I want you to do is just to read out the numbers as quickly as you can out loud, okay? So shall we practice? So for the Russian speakers, you just need to be able to say 1 and 2, okay? So are you all ready? All together, ready, and go.
1, 2, 2, 1, 1.
Now you have to do it like a choir, all at the same time. Are you ready? And go.
1, 2, 2, 1, 1.
Very good. Now I'm going to show you a longer list as fast as you can. Let's read them out. And go. Okay, yeah, that wasn't very good. Okay, let's do it again. Okay, let's do exactly the same again, as fast as you can, but with other people around you, okay? Are you ready? And go. Okay, yeah, that was a little bit better, but we had like 2 choirs, yeah? One on that side, one on this side. Okay. Here's the test. You will have seen all those numbers. There was a number 1 and a number 2. This time I'm going to show you the same, but when you see a 1, I want you to say 2. And when you see a 2, I want you to say 1. Okay? As quickly as you can. Are you ready? And go. Did somebody say 0? So, why was that more difficult? Because it's what we call a cognitive switching task, or an attentional switching. Every time you saw something, you wanted to do the reading, and then you had to say, no, stop, do the other one. No, stop, do the other one. So that's called attentional switching. And these sort of things are very difficult for many people with TSC. It's hard for lots of us, so it's not a diagnosis for TSC. But it just gives you an example of one specific bit of brain skills that can be difficult for many people with tuberous sclerosis. And now the last bit of our umbrella is the psychosocial level. This is where we're going to say, what is the impact of living with a disability, of living with a chronic condition, of living with a rare disease, of living with the uncertainty, with the certainty of uncertainty? What's the impact it has on me, on my family, on my relationships, on my siblings, on my children? Because we know that TSC has a major burden on people's lives. And why we wanted to list this as a level is to make sure that we remember to talk about it. Sometimes just acknowledging that things can be hard is a really powerful thing for families. We can't always change things, but sometimes just engaging and supporting and hearing what people are struggling with can be very, very powerful. It's also something that often makes people feel less lonely. I've met many mums and dads who thought they were the only ones who were really rubbish at doing this and that their relationship was struggling because of it. And then when they realize it's a problem for everybody, it's actually quite empowering. It's quite liberating to feel it's a universal challenge. It's not just me. So that's our tanned umbrella. And I'm very conscious of time, so my time is already up. Let me just give you the headlines of what we are saying we want people to do. Number 1, everyone should be screened for tanned at least once a year. And when we went to the TSC community, people said to us, oh, can you give us a tool? Because I can tell you our doctors won't know how to screen. And that's the reason we came up with the tanned checklist. And we made the checklist based on all these things that I've just talked to you about. Simple checklist, pen and paper, yes, no answers, takes about 10 minutes. It's free. It will always be free, and we want it to be available to doctors to have a conversation with families. And Lauren was the one who did the validation of it. She was very involved in the early stages. She made me make a little movie showing how we can interview people about it. So that's open, and anyone can use it if you want to show it to anybody as well. And then the next thing we asked the TSC community was, what else do you want us to do? And people said, can you please translate the TAN checklist? Because not all of us speak English, you know. And so we've already done lots of language translations to date. We do it with the community. We always do it free of charge. Who can tell me what language this is? Who wasn't there yesterday? And look, here's a new disclosure. Who can tell me what language this is? It was published yesterday. So we now have a Dutch version and a French version that in this part of the world you can use. So I hope it'll be a useful tool for all of you. The second recommendation is at key developmental time points, every person with TSC should have a more detailed evaluation to look in the first 3 years of life, to plan the next step, before school, to plan school, in early school, to plan secondary, during adolescence, to plan transition to adult life. And that is a comprehensive process. It's not always easy, but that's the recommendation from us. And then the third thing is, whenever there's sudden change, unexpected things, people should look at the physical difficulties, epilepsy, SAGA, kidneys, drugs, side effects of medications, etc. And just a very last comment that I'm going to end on is, people were still very worried about this overwhelmingness of TAND manifestations. And what Lauren then did as part of her PhD, it was the microphone going in and out, she wanted to see, can we find clusters in individual people, natural clustering of some TAND manifestations, because we know we all have different patterns. And so what she did through a range of different ways was to look at first a small group of people and then about 500 people with TSC using the TAND checklist. And she found that all the complex TAND manifestations group into about 7 different clusters. I won't talk about them in any detail, but you can see a scholastic cluster, an impulsive, overactive cluster, all those neuropsychological deficits have a cluster, aggression and temper tantrums have a cluster, eating and sleeping problems is a cluster, mood and anxiety is a cluster, and then the autism spectrum cluster that fits sort of on top of all of that. Same phenomena, but I think it'll be important for us to explore how we can use this in future. Lots of new things to come. We will have more time in the next session and after lunch to talk about some of those, and I'll just add some of the comments there. But really just to end on, many people are interested in, can we cure tuberous sclerosis? And people use the word, particularly in America, people like to use the word cure. And my feedback about that brings me back to my own story. If by cure we mean we want to get rid of people who live with disabilities, then I don't agree with it. If by cure we mean optimizing people's life, quality, chances, finding things early, treating them, improving life, then I'm with you on curing as much as we can. And really then just a last note, just to end back with Lauren. Here's Lauren presenting last year before she became very ill. I think the fragility of life, the shortness of life, and losing somebody as beautiful and talented as young as that just reminds us all to look for the positive things, to find the pleasures in our family members, in ourselves, between husband and wives and partners, with siblings, and to celebrate and enjoy the positive things while we have them. And that's my wish for all of you. Enjoy the pleasures and find the shared pleasures and make sure that you live a positive life, even if it is with a disability. Let me stop there. Thank you, Eva.